Hi, welcome. I'm continuing to weave the lattice pattern here with raven's tail techniques. I've gotten to the middle section. I added some more copper and I'm down to uh, working towards the bottom. I was reading a Tsimshian story about a white bear and an adventure uh, on the mainland. So I'm going to finish that story today as I demonstrate weaving. So again, thank you for joining me and happy weaving. So I'm going to continue reading the story from the Tsimshian Text new series by Franz Boas. And it is Henry Tate that helps translate this for him. So I'm starting in the middle of the story, and I hope that if you've missed the first part that you will go back to previous videos to hear the beginning. But it is about a hunter who follows a white bear up a mountain, then up a ladder, and arrives in the sky. The chief is the sun chief, and he has a daughter who was disguised with her white bear skin. And so they married, the hunter and the daughter, and we continue the adventures. Then she loved her husband very much. Her love increased now. One morning, his father-in-law said again, "Tell my son-in-law that I order him to draw water in the mountain. I want to drink it." It was this that the father-in-law, son, said to his son-in-law. Then the wife of a Cedarwall said to her husband, "Don't go there. You might die of it. Many were they who have drawn water. They tried it, and then they could not do it, for the living mountain closed and crushed them entirely to pieces in a little while." Thus said the woman to her husband. The mountain always closed because it was alive. Therefore it did so. That was where the spring was, in the mountain. It was way in. Then Estiwal said, "Don't be afraid." Thus he said to his wife, "For I myself have also supernatural power." Thus said Estiwal to his wife. Then Estiwal rose again and requested the great slave of his father-in-law to point out to him where the spring was. That was where they went. Then the great slave spoke, and when they were to go to the spring, "Didn't you sometimes get water in the mountain?" Then the great slave said, "No, but I know where the spring is." And they continued to go. Suddenly they arrived at the great cave where the spring was, and then he showed Estiwal where the water was flowing out. The great slave pointed in the place where the spring was in the cave, and then the great cave closed again, and Estiwal counted again how often the rock closed, and then it slowly opened again. And when it did, Estiwal counted and found that it closed 4 times. Then Estiwal said to his companion, "Go ahead, you go in first, and I will go in afterwards." And when the rock closed again verily, he suddenly pushed in the great slave. And when the rock closed, he was crushed. Then, however, Estiwal counted again, and he stood quite ready to draw water in his little basket. At the 4th time, Estiwal flew in, and then he drew the water in the spring of the mountain. Then he returned and went to his house, and he told his father-in-law that his companion was crushed, that the rock had closed in on him. And then Estiwal gave the basket with the water that he had drawn to his father-in-law. It was full of the water of the mountain that his father-in-law had ordered him to draw. And then he was suddenly much ashamed because his supernatural power had been unfortunate, and Estiwal had won twice his supernatural powers. Then Estiwal went to his wife, and his wife rejoiced much because he had come to her again. His father-in-law, however, was very heavy of heart on account of what had happened, that his great slave was dead. That was why the chief did this. He took his net and he opened the end of the fireplace at the door. That is what he opened, and that is where he put down his great net. And then he drew up the bones of the great slave who had died in the mountain. And when all the bones had been drawn up, he put them down carefully on a great board. Then the chief called towards the fire the wife of Astiwal, and the young woman stepped over the bones of the great slave of her father, and then the great slave arose again suddenly, and he was alive again. Then she went again to her husband. One morning the chief said again, "Tell my son-in-law that I order him to get firewood." Then the wife of Astiwal said again, "Don't go, for many people were lost. As soon as the axe touches the tree, the bark falls down and falls on the people. Then it kills them." Thus said the young woman to her husband. Astiwal only laughed again at what she said. "Don't be afraid. I have supernatural power myself." Then he arose. Then he called the great slave to accompany him. When they were within reach of the place where the great tree stood, Astiwal saw the foot of the tree was full of bones, and then he questioned his companion. Then the slave said, "Maybe, I don't know." And then they continued really to go towards it. And when they reached it, Astiwal looked up to the top of the great tree. Behold, the great one was leaning over to one side. And then he said to his companion, "You stand here, but I there." And then when he was quite ready, he struck it. But the great tree fell and broke into places. Again it had fallen on the great slave, and the great one was dead. Then Astiwal returned and related that the tree had fallen on the great slave. Thus he said when he entered. Then the chief went to where the tree was. His supernatural power was standing. Behold, the great one was all broken into pieces of the right length, and his great slave was dead among the broken firewood. And then he picked out from among the firewood the bones of the great slave. And then he again found them, and he put them well together as they had been before. And then the chief called the young woman to come out. Then the princess stepped 4 times over the bones, and the slave was again alive. When, however, Astiwal lay down with his wife, she said to him, "Only one thing is left with which my father is going to try you. This is his very last supernatural power. He will bake you in his fire, and he'll put in the fire on stones when they are hot. He will put you there." Then Astiwal did not say anything and cried the whole length of the night. Very early in the morning, the chief ordered his companions to make a fire. He had made them heat stones. Then his companions did so, and when they had finished making the great fire, they went out to get stones and put them on the fire. After a little while, the stones were red hot. Then the chief said to the young woman, "My dear, order your husband to go to the fire. The stones are hot. I have heated the stones, that he may lay down. That is why I have really heated the stones, that I may cook him." Then this princess spoke strongly to her husband. "Don't do it." Thus she said to her husband, "I don't want you to die, for I really love you." Then the chief spoke again. "Order my son-in-law to go to the fire while the stones are hot." But the wife of Astiwal would not permit it. She really held him around the waist, and she would not permit her father to bake her husband. Therefore she held him. So that is the end of my story for now.